Morning everyone and welcome. Just like to cover off today on some biosecurity essentials. It's a term we're getting more familiar with since COVID-19, but it applies just as importantly across farms. So I just wanted to mention some of the important factors we need to take into play, particularly with application for planning under biosecurity. We need to remember that it's the best defence against pests and diseases, and by implementing good biosecurity practices on your farm, you can build some quick and simple measures into it that'll protect your farm and your future. So what's involved in biosecurity planning? Well, A, you need to prevent the introduction of infectious diseases, pests and a whole lot of weeds onto your property. You need to prevent the spread from an infected area to a non-infected area. And the aim of the whole episode is to make sure we maintain our food safety and the integrity of our rural industries, not only for local market access, but also for overseas. The options for biosecurity on your property, you've just got to remember that it's a tool. It's no different to any other tool you use on your farm. It's not complicated, it's quite a simple process to go through, and it's quite often looking at things you already do on your farm. It's just maintaining the records associated with it appropriately. And that can be either paper-based or there are some really good apps and computer-based systems available. One of the easiest resources to access is through Animal Health Australia, and it's the Farm Biosecurity Action Planner. And I'm going to look at some of the information that we gather together as part of that planning process in order to produce our final plan for the property. You need to complete a checklist. You need to look at organising biosecurity zones or checkpoints on the farm where you can limit the movement of risk. So you may have the house area, and that's one biosecurity zone. You may have the shearing shed is another biosecurity zone. You may have the dairy and the yards associated with that. Look at those sorts of areas. Are you part of an integrity system or an accreditation scheme with an industry that you belong to? That will play into it as well. And the aim is to introduce management practices that decrease your risks, both short-term and long-term. And as you go through the checklist, look at those processes and look at when you're going to be able to introduce those new practices or new systems into your farm. You need to look carefully at what you do with the following 6 things. Firstly, the farm inputs. You've got to remember that any new plant or animal or machinery that you bring onto a property brings risks with it. Could be disease, could be seeds, could be all sorts of options that bring a biosecurity risk onto your property. You can minimise that by looking at things like animal health declarations, by national vendor declarations, and by commodity vendor declarations. Look at the equipment that comes onto your farm. Is it yours? Belongs there, stays there all the time, or is it contractors that may have been onto other properties? And one of the concerns that comes into this area are things like Energy Australia vehicles that may come onto your farm having been onto other properties. Look at the feed that you're buying in. Where does it come from? How reputable are the producers? Have they got a commodity vendor deck that will enable you to know there's no toxic chemicals on board? Look at water. Is there a point of contamination? Is there leakage from farms that are above you that may leak chemicals into it? Is it coming from a reliable source? Does it have high levels of minerals within that system? You may be in the fortunate circumstance where you introduce beehives onto the property as part of an apiarist managed program. Are they safe? Is there an issue concern there? Bedding goes along with feed. And finally, if you're using fertiliser, whether it's chemical or biological, does it come from a safe source? Once you've looked at the farm inputs, you need to look at the outputs. What's leaving your property? What product are you moving off your property, and how's it going there? Are you using contractors with vehicles to come and collect that off your property, out of your silos, and take it elsewhere? Can they bring contaminants with them? If you're going to shows or sales, so livestock that you're sending to sale, are they non-diseased? Are they in good health? Is there no risk of spreading disease there? Likewise for animals going to shows. Things like animal health declarations, commodity vendor decks and national vendor decks come into play in that system as well. You also need to look at product transport and packing, how well that's managed, and when you're bringing things onto the farm, is there a likelihood that you could bring disease with you? I know in the salmonella outbreak on some of the poultry properties, there's been an issue with packaging and bringing the bacteria onto the farm through that. Next, you need to look at people, vehicles and equipment. Some of this is the most mobile part of risk within your property. You need to look at property access. Who has access to your property? Are they registered when they come on? Do you have signage warning them that they need to register when they come onto the property? Do a risk assessment. Do people really need to have access to all parts of your property, or can they just come to the house and the yard area and you can organise your risk around that narrow part of the property? Do they have good personal hygiene? Do you have hand washing, boot washing, vehicle washing facilities available? And when you do, where does the wastewater go from that washing area? So vehicle and equipment hygiene is really important as part of that as well. And as I mentioned, the runoff from that washing area. Where does it go and how do you isolate that from the rest of your property? A good message and a good signage to have around is this: come clean, go clean. You should expect visitors to your property to have cleaned off their vehicle before they come onto the property, clean themselves, wash their hands, wash their equipment. Have you got people who come and do pruning on your vineyard? Have they cleaned their equipment off effectively before they come on board? So come clean, go clean. Wash down themselves, their vehicles, their equipment before they come on. Once they're leaving, same process. Wash down, decontaminate, final rinse. Same system we're all dealing with COVID-19 at the moment. Next, we need to look at individual production practices. So how do we manage plant and animal waste on our property? Is it managed effectively? Does it leave high risk? Where is our wash down zone from the dairy going to? Do we risk spreading disease from those animals onto high risk livestock like our calves? Are we minimising those impacts? Look at our feed and water storage. How do we do it? Where is it managed? Do we make sure that we clean out silos between loads? That sort of that sort of risk management. With our livestock, do we vaccinate for all the endemic diseases in our area to make sure we're not risking spread or risking disease outbreaks? Things like 5-in-1, leptospirosis. If we need to, pestivirus. Those sorts of vaccines. Are we doing them for the animals in the right way at the right time? It's all very well good to vaccinate, but we need to make sure we're following the correct regime. Chemical use. And by chemicals, I mean not only chemicals for spraying weeds, but also chemicals that we use on animals. So medications, antibiotics, are we using them as they should be used? Are we making sure that we're looking at their withholding periods or export slaughter intervals? Are we looking at drenches? Are we making sure we're not getting resistance problems for the parasites on our property? We need to monitor and look at surveillance programs for those. We also need to look at our fencing. Is it secure? Do we stop our livestock from wandering between properties and therefore risk things like vibriosis, pestivirus coming onto our property or spreading it to other properties around the area? All of those things just need to be looked at carefully. Do I need to institute a new fencing program? Do I need to speak to my neighbour about boundary fences? Do I need to look at putting aside funding to improve that over the next few years? We then need to look at ferals, pests and weeds. Feral animals, things like pigs, deer, wild dog incursions, they can all bring diseases with them. We look at leptospirosis with pigs, we can look at neospora with dogs, we can look at some of the other parasite spreads through them as well. Look at our property cleanliness. is it neat and tidy and looking hygienic? Or have we got great weed banks sitting around our cattle yards or our quarantine paddocks when livestock first come onto the property? We need to monitor where we fed livestock from hay or other feed that's been brought on board, so that we can make sure if we've got a new weed incursion, we can get rid of it pretty quickly. The other one that you need to be aware of is this term called volunteer plants. So crop plants that have escaped from the cultivated area and are in laneways or other paddocks on the property. They can remain as a reservoir for pests, and once you get a new crop in, those pests will go back to that crop. So you need to monitor and provide surveillance for those. The other important one to remember in the ferals, pests and weeds is when we have natural disasters, so fires or floods. Every time we have one of these events, there is a huge influx of weeds and other pest animals after the event. We're trying to feed with whatever feed we can find and bring it in from outside areas, so we need to monitor that. And we also get animals that are coming in to feed off that feed that wouldn't normally be part of our production cycle. So pigs will come out of wilderness or national park areas and come onto properties and feed there, bringing their pests with them. And finally, we need to look at training, planning and recording. You need to gather that information that we've talked about, put it into a biosecurity plan. And there are some really good resources around to develop that plan once we've looked at the checklist. We need to revisit it regularly. There is no point in having a plan on day one and not looking at it for 5 years. You need to revisit every 6 months, every 12 months at absolute minimum, to make sure, yes, I have instituted that new program. Yes, our vaccination regime is working. Yes, our surveillance and monitoring for drench resistance is working, because we're doing the testing that we've said we'd do on our biosecurity plan. It's also really important to keep records, and the level of record keeping can vary. If you're on a small property where you carry under 100 livestock, it may be perfectly adequate to keep that record in your farm diary. That's absolutely fine and perfectly acceptable. However, if you've got much larger numbers of livestock and a bigger business, you need to have a visitor record. You need to have treatment records, including things like batch numbers on those treatments. You need to keep record of the commodity vendor decks that you've put out, the national vendor decks you've put out, and the ones that you've acquired when you've bought in feed and livestock. You need to make sure you train your staff, not only in important things like chemicals, which is a requirement to be able to purchase them, but also in biosecurity and surveillance. Good hygiene is part of the number one things in biosecurity training. Do they wash their gear before they come on farm? Do they wash their hands while they're on farm? Do they wash it leaving the property? Do they leave boots behind on the property so that they can take clean stuff home and they're not using boots from home when they come onto your property? Can all be an important part of that biosecurity training. With chemicals, the ability to keep records, know and understand how to manage them effectively is really important, and training in that takes place on a routine basis. And finally, surveillance. It's really, really important to monitor what's happening on the property. Keep an eye on livestock. Make sure you're checking them on a regular basis. Likewise, with crops, you need to take a walk through the crop, monitor whether they've got pest incursions, whether they need chemical sprays, whether they've got mildew taking place. All those sorts of things are important. And without actually doing some surveillance and monitoring and training people in what to look for, everybody is at a loss. And finally, it is absolutely paramount that you report issues. Part of the Biosecurity Act is that it's an obligation to report suspect weeds, pests and diseases of plants and animals. One of the really common advertising campaigns that we use for animal surveillance is look, check, ask a vet. Really, really simple. Same applies for weeds, same applies for pest animals, same applies for any plant diseases that you notice. Ask the question. We're there to support you and your industry as much as possible. There's two important numbers on the screen there, both for the Exotic Plant Pest Hotline and the Emergency Animal Disease Watch Hotline. Take a record of them, keep them on hand, and remember, you can always call Hunter Local Land Services to give you assistance.